Paul got in touch quite early this morning. Paul was texting me at 10:01. Shall I read you the 3 texts that came in between 10:01 and 10:02 from Paul? The first one reads, he'll get the old left-right good night. The second one reads, then I'll turn around and roundhouse your block off. And the third one reads, wrong chat, sorry. So now everybody wants to know about the chat that Paul was actually engaged in, where he's threatening to roundhouse somebody and knock their block off. And of course, many people have already asked the question of how on earth will we be able to tell if there are some repercussions and side effects to the rather hefty knock on the head that you received this morning. Okay, back to business. The obvious story is JD Vance. Someone cleverer than me on Blue Sky yesterday wondered almost immediately after those comments emerged what the gaslighting rowback would look like. To be clear, JD Vance was commenting on plans to put an Anglo-French peacekeeping force on the ground in Ukraine, 20,000 British and French troops, which he then described in terms you would have heard already, but which I will remind you of shortly. When the impact of his words became clear, in fact, I think you could probably say, when he began to realise the severity of what he had said and the impact of what he had said, he was left with little choice. He could either apologise, which these people, of course, are incapable of doing for reasons that we've discussed at some length, or he could claim that he hadn't said what we all heard him say. He could claim that when he was discussing the plausibility of an Anglo-French peacekeeping force of 20,000 British and French troops being deployed on the ground in Ukraine, he wasn't actually talking about Britain and France. And, of course, if you've been listening to this programme for the last couple of weeks, you'll have picked up on that moment of doublespeak, whether deliberate or not, but to move in moments from saying one thing to claiming that you had never said it. There was a distillation of this phenomenon in the Oval Office on Friday, wasn't there, when Trump was asked about his description of Zelensky as a dictator. And Trump responded, of course, by expressing skepticism that he ever could have said such a thing. And these moments are really important. They're funny on one level. They're a little bit chilling on another, a little bit ridiculous on yet another level. But they're really important because they describe the denigration of truth. They describe the dismantling of objective reality. My goodness me, Orwell was good, wasn't he? I know we all reference him too often, and I know sometimes he's not the author that you should be turning to, and I know an awful lot of the people, particularly online, who cite George Orwell have clearly never read a word he wrote, except possibly a couple of slogans about Big Brother. But doublespeak, this tool in the dictator's armoury, this weapon of oppression, this ability to actually destroy the meaning of language itself is unfolding in plain sight. You know, I think it began with Kellyanne Conway and the alternative facts narrative. But I don't think we realised even then just what the next stage would look like. It looks like a throwaway comment for Donald Trump. I can't believe I would have said something like that. And everybody laughs because everybody in the room is now more or less hand-picked. But of course, it means that nothing he ever says has agency. He can't be held to anything that he ever says because tomorrow he might say the opposite. And that is why the JD Vance story, scandal, episode, immediately claiming that his comments had somehow been misinterpreted, but it's not bothering any parsnips anywhere except, oddly, in what passes for Kemi Badenoch's brain. James Cleverly, the former Foreign Secretary, was unequivocal in his condemnation. Foolish and insulting throwaway remark, hurtful and thoughtless. Kemi Badenoch, incredibly, sought to defend it, but it turns out that they're great friends. Even Farage put the boot in, although I think he probably had very little choice. He's probably hoping that no one digs out the footage of him describing how he's been best pals with JD Vance for over a decade. Unlucky, mate. We'll be playing that a little later in the programme. But I'll tell you where it led me. It led me somewhere I don't really want to go. It led me to the thought that we're all engaged in a bit of a pantomime at the moment. And I don't think it's deliberate. I don't know if you heard Angela Rayner being interviewed yesterday, where she was unable really to answer any questions because you can't answer any questions. Imagine I handed you a sack full of ferrets, right? and I asked you what you were going to do to persuade the ferrets to behave, or I asked you what tools you had in your arsenal that would allow you to exert some influence on the ferrets fighting in a sack. That's why Angela Rayner couldn't really answer any questions yesterday, because the British government could lay out a policy position and Donald Trump could defecate all over it 1 hour later, and yet they have to stay, to quote that wonderful musical Hamilton, they have to stay in the room where it happens. I think that Keir Starmer is doing what he needs to do, knowing that he's doomed to fail. Well, that's a real moment, isn't it? Politically, diplomatically, even, I think, historically. Keir Starmer is doing what he needs to do, knowing that he's doomed to fail. Because what JD Vance said yesterday was, I think, really, really hideous. For a foreign politician to malign the military service, let alone the sacrifice of every member of the military who has served in the last 30 or 40 years in such a crass and obnoxious way, someone who's never seen proper active service, and of course works as vice president for a man who actually dodged the draft. I'll say that again, he dodged the draft. It's another moment of, is it doublespeak or newspeak in 19? I need to read it yet again, don't I? It's another moment, of course, because they were trying to attack Zelensky for the fact that Ukraine has conscription. And of course, the United States had conscription. It had military service. You were called up. It had the draft. Unless you were rich and you could deploy doctors and lawyers and the rest of it, you had to go to Vietnam and quite possibly die in the service of your country in a war that they ultimately lost. That's the last war that America fought on its own, was Vietnam, and they lost. But that doesn't stop JD Vance maligning the military service of every member of the British military who served in the last 30 or 40 years, let alone the ones who made the ultimate sacrifice. So the doublespeak comes when they condemn Zelensky for conscription without mentioning the draft. It comes when Vance condemns Britain and France for not being significant military forces, haven't fought any proper wars, and the only war they fought on their own, they lost. The United States of America remains the only country in history to trigger Article 5 of NATO, which means that every NATO ally was engaged in the deployments in Afghanistan. And that was a moment of such unutterable obnoxiousness that we haven't actually got the vocabulary properly to chronicle it. We can all spit our dummies out, or we can all spit nails or feathers or whatever it is that you spit. We can all, I think quite rightly, reflect upon how this would have gone down with military families. One of the early texts that I got yesterday was from a 21-year-old lad describing his dad's response. His dad has tours under his belt where he was doing a lot more than writing press releases, which is what, as far as I can tell, JD Vance's military service consisted of. I apologise, the Australians fought in Vietnam as well, didn't they? But the last war they fought without us, they lost. But what the Vance moment brought home to me was the possibility that nothing Keir Starmer does matters in the context of controlling or influencing Trump. That's why I say he's doing what he has to do, but he knows he's doomed to fail. So those photographs of Starmer in Downing Street for a meeting that had already been scheduled, but I don't think they were expecting Justin Trudeau to turn up, or possibly a couple of other dignitaries and leaders, senior politicians. The pictures were reassuring. The sight of Keir Starmer chairing the meeting, for those of us who are under no illusions about how stupid Brexit was, it was quite a nice reminder of what a unified Europe looks like. But what possible leverage does Keir Starmer have? And oddly, the thing that made me think of that was JD Vance's comments yesterday, because what can we do? What can we do? By we, I mean the British establishment, the British government. What can we do? King Charles is going to have to shake that man's hand at some point. You know, King Charles's son was on active duty in Afghanistan. He's going to have to shake the hand of a man who says we haven't been involved in any wars for 30 or 40 years. There's nothing we can do. There's no send back the ambassadors or diplomatic incident. It probably doesn't reach that threshold. But in terms of how offended you are and how offended I am, there is absolutely nothing we can do. There is no consequence The only reason why he's tried to row back on it is just to sort of make it go away, to avoid brouhaha. He's not trying to avoid punishment. He's not trying to avoid consequence. He only put it on Twitter. He didn't even bother giving an interview or making an actual apology. And of course, he hasn't even apologised. He's lied. He's done newspeak. He's lied about what he actually said. He's claimed that when he was talking about a peacekeeping force consisting of British and French troops, he wasn't actually talking about Britain and France. He was talking about unspecified random other countries. But any country in NATO that responded to the triggering of Article 5 came to the aid of the United States when they went to Afghanistan. And I think the thing I'm frightened of saying out loud to you this morning is that none of this matters. None of this matters. Not in the context of being able to apply a brake or exert influence on Donald Trump. None of this matters. He's going to do whatever the heck he wants, regardless of what anybody else says or anybody else does or anybody else counsels. I am an admirer of Keir Starmer, historically, and I think he's had a really good week. The speed with which his diplomatic success in the Oval Office fell apart was desperately unlucky, but not exactly unpredictable, was it? For somebody to have said on Thursday, in fact, listen, I'm not blowing my own trumpet. I've just remembered that I did say on Thursday this could all have fallen apart by Friday tea time. And lo and behold, it all fell apart by Friday tea time after that hideous punishment beating of Volodymyr Zelensky. So the question I want to ask you is whether or not all of the ministrations, all of the front pages, all of the meetings, all of the hand-wringing, all of the considered diplomatic analyses, does any of this matter at all? Is anybody anywhere capable of exerting any influence whatsoever upon Donald Trump? Are we living a form of pantomime? We're not being conned by Keir Starmer, but there's a sort of delusion of which we are all part. We are behaving, and I don't know whether it's normality bias, but we are behaving as if business as usual is underway, as if Tony Blair could sit with George W. Bush and stay his hand, you know, better to be in the tent than outside it. We actually do have some agency in that meeting, and I think we did. I think most historians, most critics would agree that Blair was a junior partner in a real partnership. I don't think any of this matters. I don't think any of this matters. 17 minutes after 10 is the time. That's my question for you. When you look at what JD Vance said yesterday, his hideous comments about British troops, about British military history, and his subsequent lies, and you realise that there's not actually anything we can do about it. We can't rescind the invitation for the state visit. We can't tell Donald Trump that he's welcome, but he has to leave JD Vance at home. We don't have any leverage or power, and that's soft power. It's a conversation we had last week, isn't it? At all. And I don't know what that means, but I want to know whether you agree. Are we all engaged in some sort of diplomatic pantomime that is the only thing we know how to do, but which is utterly pointless because the President of the United States of America is like nothing that we have ever seen before? You look me in the eye and tell me that you think Keir Starmer can whisper in his ear and stop him from doing something. I've shifted from thinking you want to be the last person that he spoke to, but someone else will be the next person. You can't be the last person that he spoke to. I used to think that was clever. You know, Starmer, very clever, last person that he spoke to. But you can't be the last person that he spoke to because he's going to speak to somebody next. After he's announced the thing that he's announced as a consequence of you being the last person that he spoke to, he's going to speak to somebody else and announce something different. And announce something completely different. Can Keir Starmer do anything in this context? 0345 6060 973. I hate this, and I hope you understand where this question is coming from. But are we all kidding ourselves that the United Kingdom has a role to play in the peace process, in the American administration, full stop, on the world stage that is currently dominated by Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, and Xi Jinping? Was the Kremlin right when they talked about Europe having been hobbled, having been ended, if you like, as a viable political force. So there you go. Look, that's a big one. 20 minutes after 10 is the time. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. The question underneath all that pontification is pretty straightforward. Does Keir Starmer have any leverage whatsoever in his dealings with the White House? Does Keir Starmer have any meaningful influence whatsoever, given what we know about Donald Trump and what the comments of JD Vance yesterday showed us our hand looks like? Vice President of the United States of America has committed the cardinal sin, the unthinkable sin of insulting our military dead, and there's nothing we can do about it.